Welcome all to this roundtable on the global crisis. My name is Rajani. For starters, I'd like to thank Surbhi and Elka and many others whose names I don't know for accepting this proposal and admitting us into this conference, and for many other courtesies besides. We're a set of 7 scholars, and I'll name them: Sandy Darity, Matt Forstater, Jen Vaughan, Ross Fuller, Asad Zaman, and Steve Keen, representing a certain spectrum of diversity, not always possible in a single panel. Now, I've divided this time into 2 halves. The first half, I'll pose one of 3 queries each to each panelist, and each will have 3 minutes to answer. The 3 questions are: 1, what is the global crisis a crisis of, and how did we get here? The second question is, where are we headed if whatever's going on is unchecked? And thirdly, what, if anything, can be done? In the second half, the last half, we'll open to Q&A from the audience, if any, and cross conversations amongst the panelists themselves. I'll moderate the session, and that's only a statement of intention, and the Q&A to follow. And Diane Weidenkopf, who's far more important than I in this process, will be helping us with technical issues and will also hold us all to time if in somewhat rigorous fashion, as we will learn. So for starters, the first round of questioning will be alphabetical. After that, I mix it up. So I'm going to call upon Sandy to answer the first question: what is this global crisis a crisis of, and how did we get here? Thank you.
In 3 minutes, okay. So first, let me indicate that I think that there are 3 types of global crises. The first is a crisis of political systems. The second is a crisis of equality, equity, and justice. And the third is a crisis of planetary dimensions. The first one, the crisis of political systems, is a consequence of the fact that there has been a tendency to elect fascists to office through political systems that are ostensibly democratic. And once they're in office, they are reluctant to leave office. And in fact, even if they lose an election subsequently, they will try to maintain their position of authority and power. So that's the first crisis. The second is the crisis of equality, equity, and justice, which is a consequence of the legacy effects of slavery and colonialism, and the fact that the nations that exploited other human beings across the globe through the mechanisms of slavery and colonialism have never had a reckoning and have never made any form of significant payment for the harms that they have engendered. And then the third is the crisis of planetary dimensions, which is the crisis associated with the phenomenon of climate change. This is global. The impacts are continuing to become more and more evident in an accelerated fashion, an unexpected accelerated fashion. And so that's the third major crisis that I would describe as being a global crisis.
Okay. Assuming you have finished, I will now ask Matt to continue.
Good morning. And I think just to continue the discussion from Sandy's, putting it very eloquently for this time of the morning, especially for us. I have been thinking a lot lately about Johan Galtung's idea of structural violence that he introduced 50, 60, it was in the 1960s. He had a paper, Structural Theory of Imperialism, and he added structural violence to what we normally think of as direct violence, or not only physical, but violence in a more direct way, but that institutions and structures actually can give rise to violence and can, in fact, be violent. And over the years, others have extended this idea of structural violence to specifically include economic violence, Barbara Chasen. And so unemployment, poverty, inequality, these are forms of violence. And I think strategically, we can perhaps think about more effective ways of addressing these forms when we explicitly acknowledge them as part of increasing, I think, in severity, and then most recently, the idea of ecological violence. So the planetary third aspect that Sandy referred to.
30 seconds.
Absolutely today. So I think we have, a global crisis that, yes, is economic, political, is moral, even, dare I say, spiritual crisis facing humanity today.
Thank you, Matt. And Roz, will you continue the conversation?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I focused mainly on law and politics. And I would say that one of the key drivers of the crisis today is that almost everywhere in the world now, we use an electoral system that we equate with democracy, and that this lends itself to elite capture very, very easily. Because in order to more on throwing everything into one batch in order to try to win. So you see things that should be independent, like media, like academia or education, or like even courts, being sacrificed to this goal of trying to win power and trying to win it absolutely. And of course, that just raises the stakes as people try to lock in victory, which means the eventual situation will be one where someone succeeds in winning absolute power, probably eventually. And in between, it doesn't leave us with a way of dealing with all of these other issues that we have to deal with, because we tend to just transfer power back and forth between elites that are bent on winning this victory over each other and on acquiring those resources for each other and for themselves that they can later use to fight their battles. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing the stakes raise and raise and raise to ever more authoritarian forms of government and ever more authoritarian ways of dealing with issues. But at the same time, also a kind of laissez-fairness, and that those issues that are of most importance to ordinary people just fall by the wayside. And I mean, I think the coronavirus has been a good example of this, the way it's just all been pieces here and there and nothing particularly effective has been done on it. So that's me.
Thank you, Roz. Steve, would you like to continue?
Myself, yes. Okay, well, I'd see us as having a crisis which are a combination of overshoot and ignorance. Overshoot in that we have at least quadrupled the load that we were putting on the planet back at when the limits to growth came out 50 years ago. We have about twice the population and something like twice the energy consumption per head. And that has stressed the ecosphere dramatically, and we're going to see the ecosphere responding as it does when it has too much energy stored in the atmosphere and the ocean. And that may well undermine the capacity to maintain the sedentary civilizations in which we live. Now, we've done this courtesy of ignorance. And by ignorance, I mean neoclassical economics. We have a dominant ideology or so-called theory of capitalism, which is, of course, our dominant social system today, which is antediluvian in its understanding both of our humanity's role on the biosphere and how humanity's own society actually functions. So I've been, as I said, horrified. I've spent 50 years being a critic of mainstream economics. I've never read such garbage as I've read by Nordhaus, Mendelssohn, Toll, the neoclassical economists who've so-called specialized in climate change, reduced it to the weather and trivialized it, and encouraged us to continuing steaming forward well past the capacity of the planet to support us. At some point, we're going to hit a brick wall that they think is 200 years in the future. It's more likely 20 or less. And when that happens, it's quite possible we won't be able to maintain sedentary civilization anymore. And in the middle of that, we need to work out how to finance, if we're going to do anything to try to reverse this, how do we finance the command of resources necessary to conduct a world war level of effort to try to reduce our damage to the biosphere? That's where modern monetary theory can play a role. But even there, we're fighting again the ignorance of mainstream economists and politicians and journalists they've informed, who don't understand money. We're having Ptolemaic conversations about whether money is created by banks lending or not, and Ptolemaic conversations about how the government finances itself. So the combination of overshoot and ignorance, and one wouldn't have occurred as badly without the other. I don't deny that humans, as the dominant predators on the planet, always like to overstep the mark, but we've overstepped it far more courtesy of our dominant ideology, which is the one that everybody in this room has been fighting for most of their professional careers.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Jen, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you so much. I think that we actually have two economies and we don't realize it. One is an economy based on exchange in the market, and the other is a gift economy, a maternal gift economy that has to be practiced by motherers for children who are too young to take care of themselves and can't give back an equivalent in exchange. And so everyone has a time of, say, 3 years when they are in reception of a model of unilateral giving. And that is the time in which most of our patterns of understanding are laid down. At around 3 years, children begin to understand quid pro quo, and they then are turned against or away from this original pattern of giving and receiving and giving again. That pattern is very varied, and it goes throughout life in many different ways. One person can give to many, you can give again, and so on, but it is, and you can receive from many, etc. But it is not quid pro quo. It is not exchanged. And in the gift economy, the maternal gift economy gives value to the other. You satisfy the need of the other person and concentrate on that need and on the other. And if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't have given to them. So that is basically implies the value of the other. Instead, the exchange economy, you give to the other in order to get back. And so that is an ego-oriented logic and interaction. These may seem too simple, really, to be important, but actually the most simple things sometimes are very important. And so I think that our values are in contradiction between these two systems of gifting and exchange. I'm sorry, and the exchange system is parasitic on the gift system and on the gift ways and values, but I'll have to talk more later.
Thank you, Jen. So if you can round it off, Asad.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think that the crisis we face is a crisis of knowledge. Wrong ways of understanding the world became established. The cause of this goes back to over a century of warfare between Christian factions, which led to loss of faith and religious trauma among European intellectuals who saw that we have everybody was wrong on something which everybody deeply believed. As a result, they said that from now on, we will trust only what we can touch and see, and we will not trust our feelings. This is crucial. They rejected the heart as a source of knowledge. So I was trained in the same tradition. So I was totally shocked and surprised to find in the Quran that it mentions the heart as an instrument of, he relies on his mind alone. And this is what makes basically, when the Europeans cut out their hearts, this enabled them to go on a journey of global conquest and colonization, which has traumatized the rest of the world. And so this, in fact, there is a clear study of how was it that Europeans conquered the globe and not the other way around. It is because they were heartless. They had a comparative advantage in violence, as had been mentioned by a number of people who have studied this issue. So today, the only way to solve this problem is to reinstitute this. This heartlessness is perpetuated by our systems of education, which teaches about math, logic, chemistry, physics, but nothing about compassion, nothing about sacrifice. Economists spend their lives figuring out why are people kind to each other? And there are books and books, and how can selfish psychopaths behave in a way which thinks about others? So this is the basic model. The evolution of cooperation never renounces the idea that human beings are psychopaths, and then they are in a deep puzzle about how can they be kind and how can they be compassionate, and they're still trying to figure this out. And so until we change our educational systems to teach about the heart, the spirit, the compassion, and the humanity of human beings, we will not be able to solve this crisis. Okay, that's...
Thank you, Asad. So I guess that concludes the first round of answers to that first question. And now we move to the second question, which is, where are we headed if whatever we think is going on continues unchecked? And to start us off will be Roslyn.
Yeah, I think there's two likely paths. The first is that we already are living in an oligarchy in most of the Western world. I think that will just increase. We'll have a new aristocracy of the super wealthy. Underneath that, we'll have a layer, like I call them courtiers. I guess you could also call them bourgeoisie or any number of other things. And then the mass of humanity under that somewhere. Because in a society like that, because you're not depending on democracy, you're not depending on people, you don't need to care for them, you don't need to make sure they're educated, you don't need to try to get the best out of your people because you've kind of cut yourself off from them already. I think that this will be, we've already seen a lot of that, and that we've kind of experienced a sort of revival of anti-scientism in many ways, where we're not really focused anymore on education, on facts, and on those things like rationality and enlightenment thought. The other potential, like different scenario would be where instead of this kind of aristocratic society that could last a very long time and is the norm for most of human history, would be a kind of populist backlash, if you want, or an anti-elitist backlash. And of course, we saw that last century. Both like really kind of Stalinism and fascism were both aspects of that anti-elite backlash, where you see movements rise that are anti-corruption, anti-decadence, but usually quite traditionalist and authoritarian as well, as a kind of means of trying to destroy the elite, but also destroying a lot else with it. So I think those are probably heading in one of those two directions at this point, because it seems very, very hard to put things back together and go back to where we are. And it seems that there's not a lot of interest in going back to where we are, which is a much slower and more difficult path of trying to construct institutions again, rather than just destroying the enemy, which is where we're at right now.
Thank you, Raz. Steve, if you would care to continue. Steve?
I'll continue with my ecological theme, and that is that we're certainly going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial, actually about 0.3 of a degree from there now on global average. 2 degrees is far more likely. And at that level, we're almost certain to tip the Arctic summer sea ice into a non-existence, which means we'll absorb, rather than reflecting 90% of the energy that falls in the Arctic Circle, we'll absorb 90% of the energy. Now, people don't actually understand this if you haven't read the literature, and I didn't know this, of course, myself until I read the climate science literature. The Arctic gets more sunlight power during its summer than the equator does. The equator is in the sun for less than 12 hours a day. The polar is in the sun for 24 hours a day. That difference means it actually absorbs more energy. There'll be a huge spike to the energy content of the biosphere. When that starts to happen, it's already beginning, and that will destabilize all the weather patterns. Now, the scariest lot is work done by the guy who discovered the hole in the ozone layer, James Anderson, professor of chemistry at Harvard University. He asserts, he's not agreed to it by all, that will mean you'll break down from having 3 circulation cells in the Northern Hemisphere to 1, from 0 to 90 rather than 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90. That will mean pretty much 20 to 70 becomes barren, rainfall in the 0 to 20 and 70 to 90 range. And that will destroy the capacity for sedentary civilization. But the worst thing he's putting forward, and this is a feed from the area of climate science, is that he, of course, discovered the hole in the ozone layer. And he said one thing which will happen if that does break down to 1 cell is the stratosphere will go from being a dry stratosphere to a wet stratosphere. It's not the water that's the problem. That will carry into the atmosphere chlorine and bromide, which break down the ozone layer. Now, if that happens, the ozone layer disappears. Outdoors life in the Northern Hemisphere for all mammals will become virtually impossible. Now, something like that happens, that's existential. And that is the sort of world we're rushing headlong towards. Certainly what we're going to see is we're going to destabilize the capacity for having a sedentary civilization. And my handle on this is, if you look at what are called the Milankovitch cycles, which are the long cycles from Ice Age to warm and back to Ice Age again, roughly 100,000 years long. We evolved our industrial civilizations at the peak of one of those. So we're turning from cold to hot and down again. And
30 seconds.
Going across that range, that's why we had the stability that let us build an industrial civilization to begin with. And we needed to go horizontal from that point on. Instead, we're doing this. And that will potentially destroy the capacity to have the sedentary civilizations we're in now, which brings us into Mad Max territory.
All right, then, thank you. And Jen, if you can continue.
Yes, I too believe that we're at a very terrible threshold. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is, again, our values are distorted very much by the coexistence of this unseen gift economy, which is has to do with nature, surplus labor as a gift to capital, and women's labor or reproductive labor. And the values that are created in this way are problematic because, as I said before, when a mother gives to her child, that bestows value on the child. And if there are 2 children, the one that gets the nurturing gets more value, so that we have a way of making more valuable and less valuable people according to how much they get, how much they receive, how many gifts they receive. And if you look at surplus value as a gift given to the capitalist himself feels more valuable because he receives this greater gift. And that becomes stratospheric. And it is motivating our economy towards this overwhelming difference and ability to impose the will of the strong or the privileged against the whole nature and individuals and the poor and the working people all over the world. So this is continuing unless we can find an alternative to the way we structure values. And it's not just exchange value, there is underneath this a gift value that has been transformed through exchange into gifting, into gift value, into exchange value, use value. Sorry.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, okay.
Asad, would you please step in?
Yeah, sure. I think that I'm in agreement with Steve Keen and others that we are headed towards a massive crisis, climate catastrophe. And I don't see, frankly, anything that can be done about it. Basically, what needs to be done is recognition that we are all in this together, brotherhood and fellow feeling, which is today the main problem, the main obstacle in the path of finding a solution. And solutions do exist, and lots of people have.
Asad, if you don't mind my saying, you're answering question number 3, which
okay.
is, question number 2 is simply, what's the end game? What's going on?
Well, yes, I think that the end game is very staring us in the face, and it's catastrophic. And the only thing we can do, if there's nothing to be done, is that focus on the individual instead of the society. That is, instead of try to work on the path. I don't think I have anything to add to what has been said about by Steve Keen about the climate as such. But I think that I would like to add that we are in a state of war against nature, state of, you know, the old concession of the war of all against all. This is what this planet looks like. The parents, the families are at war with each other. The community is at war with each other. We are at war with each other as nations. We are at war against the planet, and we are at war against the animals and the plants. So it's a really, this is what is happening, and the consequences of such a society are obvious. And I think it's a life would be short, brutal, and nasty. And that's what it is. So I'll stop.
Were you going to say something more? You still have time.
No, that's okay.
All right, then, Sandy, can you round this off? Sandy?
Sorry.
No.
Okay. I will try to round it out. Let's see.
Yeah.
I wanted to make one critical point that may prove to be somewhat contentious, which is our ability to blockade the rise of fascist leaders is really contingent to a large degree on the extent to which women voters around the world create a higher priority for anti-patriarchal policies versus their identification with a dominant racial or ethnic group. And this is particularly manifest in the United States, where in the 2016 US presidential election, 53% of the women who voted, white women who voted for Donald Trump. And in the 2020 election, there was a still higher proportion of them that voted for Donald Trump. So now we're in a situation in which there is a political crisis over rights that have existed for upwards of 50 years in terms of women's capacity to choose. But that circumstance is a consequence of the way in which women have actually voted in this country. And so I want to raise the provocative question about where will female citizens across the globe place their political support. With respect to the crisis that's associated with the legacy of colonialism and slavery, the answer must be programs of reparations in multiple countries across the globe. And finally, with respect to climate change, this is a crisis that we have produced through human action that may be beyond the pale of solution. But at the longer we delay in trying to improve the environmental conditions across the globe, the more likely our only option will be to try to settle other planets.
Thank you, Sandy. So now we move to our third and final question, which is, what, if anything, do you see that can be done, basically? What is possible? So we begin with Asad.
All right. So I think that the key lies in the educational system. Basically, the educational system is teaching. When I myself was a young teenager looking for guidance at MIT, I was taught chemistry and biology and physics instead of how to live. That's what I wanted to know as a youngster. How should I behave with my friends? What is the meaning of life? The bigger questions. And in fact, we explicitly went and asked one of our professors, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. First, learn your mathematics and chemistry and physics, and then this will lead you." This was a false advertisement that once you learn the micro picture, then the big picture will emerge. It never did. And so we learned the ways of the barbarians, the teenagers who have no moral guidance as the way to lead our lives. And even today, I saw a lecture by Michael Sandel of Harvard about how questions of morality have been discussed by philosophers throughout without solutions. So in fact, there are no answers, and that it is right to kill and cannibalize your person in the right circumstances, and so on. So he was teaching a sort of a toxic moral relativism. And this is what's destructive. I mean, we need to teach people how to live, but first we need to learn ourselves how to live lives as human beings instead of as competitive beings in a jungle of cutthroat competition with survival of fittest being the only moral law. This is what is currently being taught in the universities. And this needs to change. How we can do that, I'm not sure. But if the best thinkers on the planet are just fighting a battle for survival of the fittest in a jungle of ferocious competition, then obviously no solutions can be found, because we are, in effect, the brains of the planet. And if the brains are misprogrammed, then there is no way to find solutions. I would stop here.
Thank you, Asad. So Matt, what do you think? What can be done?
Well, I also feel that education in the widest sense is one of our hopes, but it has to be a multi-pronged strategy. We have many counter forces to the sort of apocalyptic and awful visions that if things go unchecked, that we may be heading toward. But many counter forces, and I think a lot of them have been mentioned. I was speaking with my son, who's very involved with the Sunrise movement. It's a youth-led environmental movement, and talking about the recent IPCC report and so on. And he was saying that we probably cannot, irreversible damage is irreversible, but it's still worth fighting to try to change. And I found that so encouraging. It gave me a lot of hope to hear a person in their early 20s say that, we can't give up, we can't give in. And so, yes, on the left, on the progressive side, instead of infighting, instead of, choosing our primary area of concern and setting others aside, coalitions that come together and
30 seconds.
Learn from the successful struggles of the past, because as I often will remark to my students, who thought in even the late 1980s that apartheid would end and without, a massive civil war, or that, I mean, many things that we could not have foreseen that that we have. So we always have to be ready. We don't want to be caught. Well,
That's time.
Okay. Sorry, Matt, but we're sticking to the time thing, but thank you. And Jen, if you would please continue now with the
Yes.
issue of what can be done.
Yes, I think that we have the wrong narrative of who we are as a species, and that by changing that narrative, our values can change and our consciousness can change. And what we think that we are Homo sapiens, or we are Homo economicus, even worse. But actually we are not, we're Homo donans. In the beginning, we are gift-giving and receiving beings. And we have distorted ourselves away from that original logic and way of being into this Homo economicus way that is what is so destructive of everything. And if we could return to the gifting way of being and understanding, which indigenous people have and had, and mother-based societies had and have, and we could do away with the market and do away with money and the ways that it is corrupting us, or they are corrupting us into the wrong kinds of being for this planet, which is actually a gift-giving planet. And a change in perspective like that could really, I think, unite people, because it would unite us under a nurturance culture instead of under a rape culture or a war culture. And that's what I think we could do. It takes a lot of consciousness raising, but women have had much experience in the last decades of consciousness raising and changing perspective into the perspective of nurturance that has, of course, not gone everywhere, but it has somewhat changed things in spite of the idea of essentialism, which is, I think, a totally wrong perspective on what is actually a gift-giving and receiving logic that is common to all of humanity, because we all have
30
the
seconds.
model of unilateral giving to us as young children. And so that is where we learn language and many other things that we do in the very first years, our first experience of the world, and we maintain it throughout our lives.
Thank you, Jen. So Steve, what do you think can be done? Steve?
Yeah, I don't think there's time for education, frankly. I think there's we simply have to get ready for the serious adjustments coming our way. We have to drastically reduce the amount of carbon we produce. If we cut off all carbon energy sources right now, the energy available to industry and consumption would fall by 80%. And we're going to be forced into a situation like that, but more likely go in the opposite direction of we're seeing now, an increase energy consumption from fossil fuels because of the impact of the failure of the climate in the first instance. So we're going to do the wrong thing first off. But I have worked on a proposal with a guy called Owen Hardy about bringing in a dual currency system where we have money as we have now, but we also have universal carbon credits, tradable credits, which everybody gets on a per capita basis. We could set those initially at the level of the average consumption of each country. Has to be done at the national level because international agreements don't happen. And if you did that, 95% of the population would have excess credits to sell, the top 5%, certainly the top 1%, would have to buy those credits off the poor. So that would be a way of imposing the burden of adjustment on the rich and doing an income transfer and wealth transfer to the poor at the same time. We need a massive rollout of non-carbon-based energy that includes nuclear. We now have factory-made water-cooled reactors, water-moderated reactors, which don't have the dangers of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Unless we do that, we're going to have an even more catastrophic fall in energy, and that's likely to mean, again, a Mad Max outcome rather than a coherent society. I think in the medium term, if we actually manage to survive all this, we have to find a way of reducing human population as well as the inequality within the human population, so we can bring it down to a level of something of, I'm not joking, something in the order of 1 billion people, where we would be a sustainable creature on the planet rather than the unsustainable one we are right now. And I think ultimately the target has to be the one that Sloan Wilson put forward, of reserving at least half the planet for non-human species. And we have to become ultimately, see ourselves as custodians of life and not rapers of it as we are at the moment.
All right, thank you, Steve. How about you, Sandy? What do you think can be done right now?
Well, I usually agree with Steve wholeheartedly, but I'm very, very nervous about the idea of reducing population. Historically, efforts to reduce population have targeted particular groups and communities. And so I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. However, I think
Sandy,
that it's...
I'm not able to see you. Pardon me for interrupting, but are you below the camera? Yeah, that's slightly better.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm below the
slightly,
camera.
Now you're
Yeah.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But what I wanted to say is, I don't think that this is a situation that can be resolved by trying to persuade everybody of a humane direction for all of our societies across the globe. This is a question of our side ultimately beating the other side. And we just have to be straightforward about it. We need a social movement, a global social movement that will be committed to the types of changes that will maintain and preserve humanity, as well as provide an equitable and just society for all people across the globe. And that's going to happen through struggle. It's not going to happen through persuasion.
All right, thank you. So that concludes the answer to the third question, which was what, if anything, can be done.
I think Roslyn. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was wondering if one of our slides. There you go, Ros. Please. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So I disagree with Sandy on this one. I think things have to be done through persuasion. I think the exact problem is that everyone is convinced that their side is just about to win, raising the stakes, as I talked about earlier, which I think is probably going to end badly rather than well. Our solution is direct digital democracy, which we already use in many cities and many countries. You know, we have millions of people using direct digital democracy to make decisions themselves about things, so to decide on issues directly. And that has a number of advantages. It often scares people because they want the right people to be in charge, and there's no guarantee with that. But the advantage is that it diffuses power. And right now we have an extreme concentration of power in the world. Probably, when it comes to wealth, probably more extreme than at any other time in human history, which is saying a lot. So the trick, I think, is that we need to diffuse that power and to spread it out among as many people as possible. It also has the advantage that it debinds issues. So at the moment, everyone has to agree on their platform or their program. If you don't agree with one tiny bit of it, sometimes you're hunted right out of the tribe or whatever. So you need to have a way for people to come together and to be able to talk fluidly on what they want and to form and come and go and form fluid majorities, rather than insisting that we all agree on one program, which is unrealistic on either side, but in my view probably favors people who are more hierarchical and more patriarchal, because they're more used to behaving that way and actually view it as a good thing. So they're actually far more likely to get their side together and actually achieve that than people who are more free thinking are likely to achieve that. It also introduces accountability, which I think is probably the best form of education. You can tell people something until you're blue in the face, but actually living it is what usually teaches people about whether or not something proved to be right or wrong. Makes it hard to continue an argument past its sell-by date. And at the moment, we're having arguments that we've had for like 30 or 40 years. We're just going on. Meanwhile, nothing gets done, as a lot of you have pointed out. because we're continuously relitigating the same arguments. We don't actually have a mechanism that introduces accountability into that situation. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, Raj. Apologies again for having missed you. So that leaves me, rather brings me to my 2 cents, which I hope is allowed. And I'm going to start, I've never done this, I've done this for 40 years, but I've never started anything with a joke, but it is a joke that's been circulating, which I have modified to suit our purposes. A woman rushes to a police officer and says, "Help, officer, help." And the police officer says, "What happened?" And she says, "Well, the river is flooding, the forest's on fire, the nuclear power plant is leaking, and there's a mass shooting at the high school." So he calmly turns to her and says, "Have you tried voting?" So you see, conventional answers will have to be set aside. We are really at a fateful climacteric. Old formulas will not do. 1984 was turned into an instruction manual, as you know, and we have gone well beyond that pale. The crisis is not sectoral, economic, political, etc. It is planetary, nor is it a crisis of capitalism per se. The entire Euro-modernist world is teetering. A new world is emergent, so it is the best of times and the worst of times. COVID, climate change, war, societal dystrophy, and nuclear disaster loom. The doomsday clock is set at 100 seconds to midnight. The only thing that might top that is an invasion of aliens from outer space. But therein perhaps lies opportunity. A wormhole is opened up. We could look beyond our current parameters and discard the entire Euro-modernist roster of ideas, which I've always felt are a libel upon the human race. It can all be undone. We can reclaim our anthropic legacy, rejecting its limpid misanthropy, not in one swoop, which is the old way, but in baby steps, shedding false slogans, false idols, false hopes, and false utopias. If we don't, then the emergent world will be even worse if climate change doesn't stop us first. You see, we live in a system that is permanently in crisis. It's not something that ends up in crisis. It began in crisis. It remains in crisis. Euro-modernism, or EM as I'll abbreviate, is the genre of modernism that Europe invented in the so-called Enlightenment in the 17th, 18th centuries prior to imposing it on the globe. In so doing, it perforce preempted any and all manner of other modernisms that might have evolved. Regrettably, barring some native people, we universally drink that Kool-Aid right now. Why is Euro-modernism crisis personified? Because as a first in human history, it deracinated the very basis of anthropic society, that is societal morality, which undergirded the social compact and was the glue that held it all, substituting a specious social contract in its stead, held up by vacuous formal legalisms backed by brute force. Diane, I'm seeing your name on the screen. It turned a band of convivials into a company of strangers. It turned mammals into reptiles. It substituted a social economy of affections with a political economy of interests, and gave us the vampire formula for dissolution of all societal ties, asocial individualism, i.e. a world where, as Sartre had it, hell is other people, in which only Darth Vaders can thrive. Statue of liberty, we. Statues of responsibility, accountability, hospitality, caring, consideration, conviviality, or that four-letter word that antidotes all of Euro-modernist economics, love. Mais non, impossible. So the real crisis that generates all crises is that we live within Euro-modernism in stark alienation, cut off from the healing matrix of our species being. So full employment, zero inflation, banning fossil fuels, ending war, gender, racial equality, 17 types of restrooms, even socialism will not even remotely remedy that primal default. You see, we are anthropic beings. Ever wondered what that means? Our highest need, metaphorically and otherwise, is to huddle. So in rank ignorance of our real anthropology, the Euro-modernist governors and their power elites manufactured in high pomposity the hypertrophic machinery of fiats, ordinances, and protocols consecrated by the tendentious delusions of equality, democracy, liberty, promises that are revocable, reversible at will, that keep us chained to the treadmills in face of an ever-expanding spate of impositions, panting, yes, we can, yes, we can. No, we can't. You see, modernist existence, as if you didn't know, is run through with isolation, loneliness, misery, anxiety, anomie, and angst. A bigger GDP does nothing to mitigate that. Equality will not blunt its pain. Democracy will not assuage it. Liberty will not pacify it. Instead, we're all slowly driven to the brink of losing even minimal sanities, as is evidenced in the daily horror of EM's vanguard nation with 1.6 mass shootings per day and rising. That is the future for all of us everywhere we want. Deprived of the innate healing bonds of a human society, the Aboriginals, the Bushmen, and simple tribal societies, we are morphed into sociopaths and psychopaths on the road to irredeemable, irreversible madness. I mean that. It's not rhetoric. We're halfway there already. Now to get to the crux of it. The crisis is one of e-modernism, the dismal dystopia we've all embraced. All it takes is to know real human anthropology to derive all that I've said. You cannot do biology or chemistry without physics. Neither can you spout social theory without a true anthropology, which is exactly what the canonical EM ideologues did in the so-called Age of Reason. They concocted theories of human nature out of thin air. Consider this: the human family, at once natural and social, gainsays, contradicts all Euro-modernist ideas. It is neither individualist, nor free, nor equal, nor democratic. Imagine that. But it gives to each of us a sanctuary called home, vital to our well-being. Ignoring and shunning that source, the modernists went trying to engineer a wholly artificial ersatz utopia based on this or other ism that can never substitute. We are animals, natural beings before we are anything else. And like the birds and the bees, we are instinctual beings. We are live, creative, cultural entities, not materialist zombies. We feel and empathize long before we deploy instrumental reason and calculation. For the really scarce resource within the Euro-modernist world is not time, nor money, but love. There's a virtual famine of it. Once we recognize all this, you're immune to any and all EM seductions or blandishments. You can also then begin to realize yourself instead of being at war within. You move from knowledge to wisdom. You have no need to become, it is enough to be, and take sustenance in the eternal standbys of family, kindred, community, the Gemeinschaft entities that were ruthlessly overrun by gazelle shaft formations such as the nation state. Connected to that mother matrix, we thrive. Severed from that, we rot. That is our human condition. We are in the first instance cooperative and convivial, not the canny, crafty, calculating, conniving, maximizing, Lone Ranger automatons, the fond caricature of microeconomics fantasies. There is built-in spontaneous order in human society. Again, I'll repeat that. There is spontaneous order in human society as there is in nature and the universe, as revealed in the early simple tribal societies. And we learn everything about our primal human nature directly from those laboratories. Even Marx got his vision of communism from precisely such forms that he called primitive communism, primitive indeed. The dissolution of those forms has a tragic and discernible history that I won't go into today. But ask yourself why the shibboleths of microeconomics, not to mention all of Euro-modernist ideas in general, simply do not apply to them. You will find a world of revealment in the answer to that, as to what we were robbed of in the implacable march of modernist progress. Thank you. All right, that is as far as what I have to say. And now I think Diane, I still see your name with a black screen, so I can't see anything else.
Well, you need to change your view in the top right corner to grid.
I see.
Gallery, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I didn't realize there was such a function, but I hope I can find. Okay, gallery. All right, I have it now. So I'm not sure if there is an audience. If there is, then certainly let's begin with some questions from there, and then we can have our own cross conversations based on everything that's been said here. Yes, a hand has been raised, and I'm not sure if the person can identify and then go ahead and speak.
Is this on? Hello, is that on? Yes. Great session. There's hardly, everybody's covered all the field, I think, very completely. It's hard to make a contribution in any regard, because I agree that we're going to exterminate most of humanity in the next few hundred years. And the only thing we can do is introduce education for those survivors coming out of the caves when the plague of people of the planets gets down to less than 1 billion, to know how to organize their society for eternity of governance from the bottom up, like Eleanor Ostrom described, to how you solve wicked problems without markets and without state. And we got, and at the moment, I know of no institution in the world that teaches how to govern organizations from the stakeholders from the bottom up, like Australian Aborigines have done for 65,000 years, controlling their population to match the environment and look after the environment. And we've got to, and I've put in the chat session references with a Indigenous Australian that we can learn from Australian Aborigines how to educate what I call governance architects to miss this education black hole of governing from the bottom up, to be in touch with the environment and let the environment control us. So the survivors of in 200 or 300 centuries know how to do it for eternity. And this probably explains why we can't rely on aliens, because they blow themselves up or destroy their humanity. And we're just an evolutionary experiment, which is out to be extinguished unless we learn from nature how to organize self-governing, self-reliant, self-reproducing systems of social society. Thank you.
Is there any question in that comment, or is it just a comment?
Well, the question is, who would like to join my network of scholars at the Academy of Management and the European Academy of Management of starting education courses? It's at the moment, we did a caucus at the Academy of Management last year, supported by a dozen leading management scholars. And tonight, the International Society of System Scientists are having a workshop of practicing, and anybody can join, it's free online, of getting young scholars who have a future and not committed to the old ways of monetary systems and top-down management, where they can start experimenting a process of self-learning by action, by doing, to this new education, fill this educational vacuum. So if you want to get involved, look up the Society for the International Society for System Scientists, because it needs cross-disciplinary. The engineers and scientists know how to design self-governing cars and rockets, but social scientists have no knowledge and don't believe in the possibility of self-regulating, self-governing organizations, which allow people to express their various human behavior, which you described. Economists assume it's all self-interest, where we all are built in, hardwired by our DNA to have contrary behavior, to search for a requisite variety of adaptations for survival. And in command and control hierarchies, which also the future leaders of our society being taught how to be dictators, because no management school teaches, or the assumption is it's all top down and they don't accept bottom up. So if you want to be active, please join our movement for those surviving in 200 or 300 centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Are there any comments on what's just been said by anybody? No. Yes, please, Matt.
Well, the part that I want to pick up on is with the reference to alternative knowledges. So I think it has been recognized that by the panelists that Eurocentrism has and continues to do a tremendous amount of damage. And I think that what we haven't, we have lots of critique of Eurocentrism. What we don't have as much is taking seriously alternative frameworks from Africa and Asia and indigenous knowledges, and to find, not in a romanticized way, but to recognize that there are alternative modes for analyzing our situation and coming up with solutions. So I just wanted to underline that aspect of what the previous speaker put in the chat.
Thank you, Matt. I think Roz had a hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I didn't. I really
Oh,
didn't.
I'm sorry. I thought I saw it.
Around here. Sorry.
Anybody wants to continue with what Matt said? Or
Do I need to go in front?
I can't. Is there a hand raised?
Yes. Nicholas Nick Karagiannis, and a couple of points. First of all, I disagree with the global social movement that William raised, for the very simple reason because circumstances can be different in different countries, different areas, etc. So I cannot agree with that. Now, I'm going to go and reinforce 2 points that Matt made. One, in terms of that the economic neoliberalism and financialization, let me use a strong word, has screwed up not only economies, not only political institutions, not only ideologies, philosophies, norms, behaviors, cultures, societies, everything, our psychology, our everything has been affected. And we talk about too negative impact on everything and everybody. And I'm saying that to reinforce what Matthew said. One, now the solution is, since I'm distancing myself from the global social movement, I would go ahead, I would also agree with Matt that we need to strengthen progressive and left-wing parties, social movements, actions, etc. As much as possible, because by doing that, and we talk about progressive alternatives and all these things, and this and only these parties can offer these alternatives. And because it is only the left parties that can deal with a very important notion: human beings.
All right, let's have Sandy respond to what you've just said. I think you disagree with him. So.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Sandy, please.
Well, I mean, a successful global movement requires the development of local movements, and so I don't have any fundamental disagreement with that. But I think that all of the crises that we've been talking about are global in character, and so it requires a social movement of citizens of all portions of the world to have the effect or impact that we really need to change the circumstances that we're faced with.
I think, I've heard this said twice, that education has been mentioned a couple of times by our panel. And at the same time, there's a sense that there may not be time enough, as somebody pointed out, for education to actually work. So how does that play out? Meaning, there isn't enough time for us all to learn from scratch how to be good human beings. So given that, what can be done in this emergency, some like this vaccines were just brought forward as under emergency authorization. So is there any such plan under emergency authorization that we can talk about or even think of or contemplate that would circumvent, the normal processes of politics that we all understand, which really have never led us anywhere except in circles. So what do you think as a panel? I mean, I'm just curious, because listening to education, because that's the standard thing, educate.
Could I jump in on this one?
Yes, please, anybody, all of you.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've noticed in the United States is actually the brilliance of the right in terms of how they frame things and how they engage in messaging. And I think that the left has failed to match that. And I think some substantial effort needs to be invested in the process of trying to design messaging that will motivate people to be compelled to act on issues like climate change and the like. When the right wing in the United States introduced the language of death panels, that was a very, very effective device. And I don't see the left in the United States managing to develop rhetorical twists and turns that have the same kind of impact.
Matt, did you want to say anything? Matt, you were also referenced in that question, comment from
No, I'm listening for now. Thank you.
I see, yeah. So how about Roz, what do you think? You do politics, Roz, and political processes, and you correctly point out that oligarchy seems to be getting institutionalized, and particularly in the West. So in fact, if I may add my own, not even 2 cents here, but what I'm seeing is that you're seeing 2 different systems emerging. The West is becoming more and more authoritarian and neo-fascist, and the Far East, if I can include Russia and China and so on, you're seeing a rather strange combination of a market economy, but completely under the control of a benevolent despotism, if you like. And I don't want to call it an authoritarian state, but certainly a state that keeps what you call capitalism, which is sometimes, I think, too big a term when you're only talking about markets being allowed to play. So you notice how China constrains its capitalists. It actually sends them to jail, believe it or not. So these systems are emerging. These may well be the models for the rest of the world. So neo-fascism, authoritarianism, and especially in the Anglo-Norman countries, Canada, Britain, United States. And then on the other side, successfully using the market, but under, which may not be acceptable to the canons of liberalism, of having a state that more or less sets bounds to what can be done, what cannot be done, what can be said, what cannot be said. So I think that's what I'm seeing. So Roz, I'd like your opinion as a political scientist, if any of that makes sense to you.
Yeah, totally. No, you're absolutely right. I think what those countries offer is at least a rule of law system that gives some semblance of fairness. I mean, not complete fairness by any means of the imagination, but a semblance of it, and at least an ideological commitment to that, where people are sometimes punished and punished severely. Whereas in the Western world, we've kind of let go of this idea. And I think it was Asad who said this earlier. We live in this kind of amoral relativism where if you win, that means you're the best, right? So the ends justify the means. And where we don't really have this idea of punishing people, even according to our own rules, or instituting a kind of fairness, even according to what we said yesterday. And I mean, that's a big part of like the broken social bargain in the Western world, which at one point said, if you work, if you get an education, like people my age were told, go to university. The problem is your parents didn't go to university. You need to go to university. You need to get an education, and then you'll be part of this system. You'll have a good life, you'll have a decent life, you'll have the life your parents and your grandparents wanted for you. And so we all went and did that, and now we're just being laughed at again, right? So people really feel that bargain is broken. And you're right, even though countries like China and Russia don't offer that idea of liberty, of course they do offer a certain security, and at least people aren't blatantly breaking all of these agreements left, right, and center. And I think at some point people will probably look at that and say, and people in other countries will probably look at that and say, hey, it's a better deal, compared to what we have right now. If I could say a few other things based on what,
please, go ahead.
So education has always been used as this reason not to let people decide directly on things, and this idea that people just need to be educated just a bit more and just a bit more and just a bit more until finally you'll be able to decide things for yourself and have your own agency. So I think in a lot of ways it's been kind of used, unfortunately, as an excuse for not involving people in decisions, this idea that there just needs to be a little bit more education and a little bit more and a little bit more until we finally get to this magical place. And I don't think that's going to happen on its own. I think you have to kind of go the other way around and just kind of start making decisions and start doing things and learning from that, even though it's kind of a bit scary and risky in some ways. And then the other thing about the left and the right, I would say, like, I mean, something I've been looking at lately because it came to me in a sense is kind of like left-wing spending in the United States and think tanks. I mean, these people are spending billions of dollars as well. So I know like the Koch brothers are out there and there's a huge right-wing nexus of funding as well that really focuses on messaging, but there's equally this like left-wing nexus, like kind of, maybe they're more like neoliberal left-wing people. Maybe they're people who are just trying to cover, you know, the actual grassroots left-wing and take the floor. But, you know, it's kind of oligarchs either way in that regard. And so I think that in some sense, I guess it's very confusing, and they call themselves left-wing, which is why it's become actually very difficult and muddled to even speak in these terms now about what's left-wing and right-wing. But there are definitely this kind of set of neoliberal billionaires that conceive of themselves as left-wing, and they're determined to speak on behalf of those people, actually, and spending billions of dollars in trying to do that as well.
Anyone else would like to join this conversation or have comments on what's been said?
Asad,
Yeah, I think that
Asad, yeah, please go ahead.
yes. Basically, someone mentioned that females have a lot of experience in consciousness raising. And I think that's basically the key requirement. So I think it is true that formal education is impossibly slow at this time, but and also impossible structurally, in the sense that we don't have the teachers available to teach people how to be human beings. But this is something which everyone knows instinctively. So, and we have at grassroots level thousands of people who know what it means to be a human being. And basically, when I was there in the 70s in the USA, I saw incredibly effective feminist consciousness raising, where people would meet in neighborhoods and discuss the inequities of society. And I found that, I mean, I was very much an outsider, and still I understood that the use of certain types of language and certain types of actions was sexist in a way that I had not understood before. So consciousness raising is, I think, the way to go. And it has to be local, as basically what William Darity said, that we need struggle, and it can't be, and this is the type of struggle we need to do. And I think it's aligned with our basic nature as human beings. So this type of struggle has a good chance of success and of rapid multiplication, because it's aligned with our nature, so it can grow exponentially. Okay, that's all.
Any other comments on this discussion, on this conversation? Yes, Jen.
Yes, women's perspective has been left out of philosophy and the patriarchal thinking for many centuries. And it really has a key to what we need to do in terms of creating a nurturing society. And that is what I'm trying to promote with the gift paradigm, and trying to see how actually many things that we're already doing are based on gifting and on other orientation. And it's completely blanked out by the kinds of thinking that patriarchy has and capitalism has. So that I think it's possible to bring forward that nurturance thinking for everyone, not just women, but there has to be an opening on the part of the establishment for that to happen.
Anyone else who wants to speak on to this issue? Consciousness raising? How about this? Yeah, go ahead.
If I can add something here.
Yes, Steve,
what we're facing problems which are beyond our intellects, individual intellects. And this is our problem. We have a political system based on individual intellects, predominantly male intellects at that. And we simply do not know how to handle the systemic crises we face. So I think if we're ever going to have a successful human civilization in the sense that it's sustainable for the indefinite term and it preserves life rather than destroying it, then we have to build the capacity to think in systemic level, systems terms. And that's, of course, that's what I've been, in terms of building the Minsky software, I've been trying to bring that to economics. That's what Jay Forrester did with the limits to growth and all the concepts that have flown out of that. But we need really to have a transcendent capacity to understand how we impact on systems. And if we realize that, we would never have got in the predicament we're in now. And in fact, our so-called profession or discipline of economics played a huge role in undermining the capacity for us to build that with the work of William Nordhaus trashing the limits to growth when the bugger didn't understand a damn word of it. And the whole profession has continued down that direction, equilibrium, maximum growth, et cetera, et cetera. So unless we ultimately have a capacity to think at a systemic level, we'll continue making these mistakes. And I think the biggest problems humanity has is we're very good at forgetting. We don't learn the lessons of the past, we forget them. And we have to find a way to preserve those lessons in whatever future society we're going to have.
What about Sandy's idea that reparations have to be part of this process of moving to, I suppose, a better world or a better system, that we can't just ignore what has happened in the past, but find some way to compensate for the damage that's been done. And that could be at many levels, not necessarily only material. What is the view of this panel on that? To what extent does the idea of making up for all the, I suppose, evil that's gone on for centuries, does that play into what's being done, or is that something that has to wait until we construct a new world, and then we try to set everything right?
Well, I'll jump in support for reparations, and I would include here colonial reparations as well as reparations for African American descendants of the enslaved, and others. But I think, and Sandy has an excellent co-authored recent book that I recommend to everyone on reparations. I think one important point that Rajani alluded to is it must include sort of financial compensation, material compensation, but that alone is not enough. Truth and reconciliation, a national and international apologies, and so on and so forth. Also, but reparations to repair it is not the culmination, but I would see it as a start.
I would like to jump in on that and
yes,
take a contrary view. I think that reparation contains a good idea at its heart, but the form that it takes is deadly. I think that collective guilt is not a good idea, and going to the past and trying to make up for it is another very bad idea, because the accounting is very hard to do. I think one should stay in the present, look at what injustices are going on right now. And when you talk about reparations, again, it always becomes us versus them. And that's another divisive element. I think we should think about all human beings are together, and we try to achieve justice in the moment and not worry about what has gone on in the past and how to do an accounting for that. I think that has a lot of potential harmful effects.
So to the extent that the problem that all of us have been talking about is associated with the phenomenon of hierarchy, all human beings are not in an equivalent position. And all human beings are not confronted with the same set of opportunities or prospects in their lives. And the issue with compensation for injustices of the past are associated with their consequences in the present moment. So in the work that I've done, the accounting exercise for restitution is one that focuses in the United States in particular on the racial wealth differential between blacks and whites. The racial wealth differential is a consequence of policies that have been pursued by the federal government over many, many years, including the provision of 160-acre land grants to white Americans during the course of the execution of the Homestead Act of 1862, while the newly emancipated freedmen were not provided any land, even though they were promised 40-acre land grants. And that's the beginning of the intergenerational disadvantage that has resulted in the current racial wealth differential. And so I think there's no difficulty whatsoever in constructing an account, at least in the United States context, because you can look directly at the disparity in wealth between blacks and whites as a basis for constructing the calculation. I also think it's really, really strange to argue that we are all equal in a world in which the conversation we've been having is one in which we are not all equal, and that's one of the core problems.
What do you say, Asad?
Well, there's a lot of things to say in response to that, but I think basically what we're talking about is strategy and not principle. I think in principle, we have an ideal to shoot for, and we have a current situation generated by the past, and we can achieve consensus and try to achieve the goal. Now, it may be true that within the current legal frameworks and the way people think, a good political strategy might be to argue for reparations based on calculations because people believe in these calculations. But the language of the heart doesn't correspond to calculations. And if we can, so there is the rational and legalistic way of trying to do things. And I think that it may well be an effective strategy in that world. But I think that there are alternatives, modes of thinking in which this would be totally counterproductive.
Well, let me add another element to this conversation, only with the view to extending it. What about reparations for the injustices and oppressions for centuries against women? When we say ex-colonies, women were probably the first colony. So how do we incorporate the notion of reparations for correction of injustices, chronic injustices that still go on in front of us for women? We're in the work that Kirsten Mullen and I've done, we're talking about chronic injustices that are race-based. Right. Certainly, there's any number of other communities that probably have legitimate claims. I would think in the Indian context, there's a major claim that could be made by the Dalits and the tribal communities of India for reparations, and I suspect the bill would be extremely large. But also, I would concede that there's probably a very significant case that can be made globally by the women of the world. That's not the case that we developed in our own work, but I welcome others to design those cases. What do you say to that, Roz?
Yeah, a very complicated question. Especially I live in Ireland. So here, when you go over to the UK, you just notice they have a lot more things over here. They have it partly because they extracted things from the country where I live in, where people just have a lot less, right? I don't know, as a woman, I guess, I'm more of the opinion that I would just like people to stop doing the things they're doing. And that would be where I'm at. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like, and this is just me thinking out of the box here, but I kind of feel like by saying I want reparations for you, I mean, I kind of get it. It's also an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, right? It's like, it's also like an acknowledgement that what you did wasn't okay. And it's also a bit evening up the scoreboards. I guess for me, sometimes it makes me feel a little bit like then I'm really dependent on those people and I'm kind of making everything about them, when really I just need them to stop their behavior that is the problem and let me go live my own life, where like I have agency and I'm not completely dependent on them, and not everything revolves around their treatment of me because I want to live my life independently of that. So I feel very split about this, because I absolutely can see the one side of it. I mean, I get it. Like, you're right. I mean, people were emancipated and then they just had to start their life again with nothing. And how are you going to do that? And how does that compound over generations? I mean, that definitely makes sense to me. But on the other hand, I just, for myself personally, I kind of just want to be more free of people getting in my way and causing me problems, or maybe treating me in a dismissive way or some other way, rather than wanting to get anything from them. But I don't know, maybe that's just a reaction to the world we live in, where I prefer to be local.
I think it's both and. I think it's both and. I mean, you want to have the knife pulled out of your back, and you also want the wound to be healed.
Yeah, I think everybody does. And I mean, like, you know, I trained as a lawyer, so I totally understand this issue, right? Like, when Vaughan has been committed, you need to put that back. You don't just say, oh, here's a slap on the wrist and you get to keep what you did, right? I mean, that's also not okay. You are rewarding injustice every day you do that. So like, I get that side of it as well.
What about you, Jen? The notion of reparations for injustices against women?
Well, I think if you frame it as an exchange, you're still inside the market logic. And so I would not like to frame it that way. Instead, perhaps restitution is a better way of looking at it. In fact, there's no way to pay back all of the harm that has been done in so many different areas of humanity or dishumanity. So in order to work towards a different paradigm, I would say that it's good to talk about restitution. I think of the lands of the Americas that were robbed from the Native American peoples, and how, you know, now at this point, what can happen? Land can be given back, but never the whole continent. So there's no equality, no equation that can be done between the harm and the gift of restitution. But I do believe that the gift of restitution can bring about a consciousness of what we've done in order to not do it again. And so that, I think, is very important, and it can bring a better life to the people who have been harmed.
Any comments on what's been said about the women's side of things?
I can say one thing, though. I also agree with what Asad said about there should be collective punishment. And I feel like maybe Sandy can say something about this since he's done the most research into it. But I do feel that sometimes in the public narrative, they end up going down this route of like collective punishment, where that seems to be the thing that's most important to the people involved. And as I say, being here in Ireland, you can see like this is an issue, right? We also have had huge issues with exactly this kind of feuding in the past. So I do think Asad had a point about that, where how do we differentiate and have, I guess, like a narrative of like, you know, reparations and being maybe more clinical, I don't know, about exactly what that's about, and then how it seems to get framed in the media sometimes, which is a kind of collective punishment, whether that be, you know, reparations for slavery, or whether that be men against women and whatever, right? I don't want to make an enemy of all men, right? Like, that's not what I want.
Well, you know, I have never thought about this as collective punishment. And in fact, Jen, I frequently use the term restitution as synonymous with reparations. So the premise is that we would want to bring, and I can't speak for other cases of reparations, but if I'm thinking about the case in the United States, the objective would be to bring Black Americans' position in terms of assets to a level that would equate their position in wealth with that of the average white American. And it would not be a question of taking money away from white Americans and putting it in Black Americans' pockets. It's not a matter of individual guilt. It's a matter of national responsibility because of the critical role that the federal government has played in creating the racial wealth gap. So I don't think in terms of punishment, but I do think in terms of restitution. I think that's a better way to think about it. Now, in other contexts, I'm not sure. There's a connection to modern monetary theory here because, people always, this reflexive question that arises out of the scarcity mentality is, how are you going to pay for it? And modern monetary theory gives us a venue for thinking about how you can pay for something without necessarily increasing taxes. Although you have to be very, very careful about your design of the project so that you don't generate high rates of inflation. I've never thought about this as a process in which, I'm taking $1 out of my white neighbor's pocket and putting it into mine. That's not how this should be done.
Yes,
And
Matt.
if I could just
focusing on materials is again a wrong.
Well, I'm
way
sorry.
to
I'm
think.
very concerned about material conditions. I'm not very touchy-feely.
Yes,
Matt,
and that's exactly what I think is the problem. The central problem is focus on rational and material and lack of focus on the soul and the heart. That's the crisis that we face, the crisis of knowledge.
I would love to have the conditions for all people to have the luxury to focus entirely on the soul and the heart. But you have to have the material conditions to be able to do that.
I think it was the poor who have focused on the heart and the soul.
I don't romanticize the poor in that way.
Matt, were you going to say something on this? I saw you about.
Well, I was just going to say that a number of proposals for reparations, restitution, you might even say, instead of collective punishment, it sort of could be a collective uplifting because it's, not good for anyone for there to be poverty. I mean, it's not good for, so, bringing, through addressing historical injustices, it can be viewed as kind of like a community economic development, which actually is can be beneficial for everyone.
I wonder if Asad is driving at something that he has not identified here.
Well, I would like to say that I think that this is a big red herring, and focusing on reparation and restitution will not get us 1 inch closer to averting the climate catastrophe, which we all face collectively. That's
Well, actually, there's a substantial case that's being made for climate-based reparations. I don't know. You may think that's a red herring also.
No, Asad, I was going to say that perhaps you didn't hear me, that perhaps what you're driving at is another concept that could be fitted into this conversation about restitution. Does forgiveness play any part? And I think it did play a part with Mandela in South Africa. Does it play any part in this discourse? Or is it outside of the frame of rational, transactional modes of thinking? I don't know, it's a question. I have no idea what the answer is.
Well, I think that learning how to be human is the central question that all of us face in our lives. And forgiveness is certainly a part of that, but forgiveness of whom? I mean, if you think that there is a collective embodiment of the white people who are oppressing the black people, then I think that's a very false image of what the world is like. This grouping of people. Every individual is an individual, and I think that's just a wrong way of thinking. But it's too difficult to
Anybody else with a comment
expand on
on
that.
this? Steve, are you there?
I might come in with a slight twist on Asad's comment there, and that is that I think we need to become transhuman. Being humans got us into this problem in the first place. We don't have a culture or an intelligence to cope with the fact that we are the dominant predator on the planet, and we have ripped the shit out of the place. And it's an evolutionary accident that we happen to be omnivores, because not only do we eat the other animals, we eat the plants the other animals eat, and we're therefore destroying the entire foundation of life on this planet. And if any reparations are needed in the long term, it's between humanity and the rest of the species on the planet, not within humanity. Now, to get to that point where we're aware of that as a collective level, obviously, even in this conversation, I think we need to go well beyond what we're thinking about. And in terms of what's going to happen collectively, I mean, I know most people are saying, yes, reparation necessary, effectively north to south. But what will happen if, for example, and this seems likely with some of the climate science research, the vast damage that's done by climate collapse happens in the northern hemisphere, and the refugees are then trying to get from the northern hemisphere to the equator, because the change in temperature and the destruction of the stability of our ecosystems will be most extreme, probably around the North Pole, up towards in the 30 to 90 latitudes, maybe where we see the biggest damage. The food systems of that part of the world may well collapse. The capacity to have sedentary civilizations here may collapse. And then, the reparations at that stage become rather laughable. In fact, the way you get the boot becomes on the other foot, so to speak. It'll be the South that's going to be handling the possibility of refugees from the North. So, but fundamentally, I think that the thing we've completely failed to understand is we've got to stop being predators. We have to become the intelligence that helps maintain life on this planet. And we're a very hell of a long way from that.
One question I have for Asad is he seems to take an individualist point of view. Now, generally in social science, the individual is not the focus of collective understanding or societal understanding, because society is not individualist. It is definitely collectivist in so many ways, whether it's the hierarchies, whether it's ideologies. So the individual, are you raising the individual almost above social forces so that we have to only cater to individual needs, and somehow that excuses there is collective behavior? So for instance, I'll give you the example of caste. A particular caste, as a caste, qua caste, can oppress another caste. That is not individual. That's not A oppressing B, but a caste, let's say a higher caste in a village in India, oppressing a lower caste. This is a collective thing, in which case the collective reparation, the collective restitution is immediately posed. It cannot be reduced to individuals. So there are many, this is just one trivial example. So there are many cases in which the collective cannot be reduced to the individual, because groups exist and group activity exists, and it's part of human society itself. So I don't think you're an individualist in the sense of individualism, but somehow you're looking at it in the perspective of maybe almost the age of reason, where they said we're all individuals, we're all free, we're all this and the other. But that was always a stretch, meaning no, we're not all placed. The placement is not the same. There is a social location, there is a structural location, there is a positioning, there is a hierarchy. And yes, a small group does rule over many others. So I don't think you can evade the question of collective response. Yes, in some cases there is collective responsibility. So I don't know how you can evade that.
Well, basically, I think the logic of the heart is very different from the logic of the head. You have to think in terms of paradoxes of Rumi, that our drop is actually the ocean contained within it, or that Mauj darya se hai, bairun darya kuch nahi, that the wave is part of the river, and without a river, a wave cannot exist. So both of these polar opposites have to be considered as truths at the same time, that an individual is nothing, is shaped by the society. And also the society is just a collection of individuals. So
there-
both
there
of
I
these
would-
truths
there
have
I
to be
would
maintained
firmly-
at the same
Yeah.
time.
No,
One
society
cannot
is not
ignore
I'm sorry,
either one.
Asad. There is no sociology that says society is a collection. That Margaret Thatcher said that, by the way, and she was wrong. Society is an organic entity and it cannot be reduced to the individuals in it. They exist ontologically at different levels. So this is really not correct. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that this is not how social science has evolved. And social science has some achievements to its credit. And one of the simplest is that it recognizes that the social exists at a level far apart from the individual. Both are ontologically real, but they cannot be reduced to each other. They are separate. Anyway, please continue.
Anyway, I believe that the social science, quote unquote, is actually just a collection of conventions of European societies, and the word science claims makes a false and deceptive claim to universality. And if you look at how societies and other societies have visualized and conceptualized, you will find dramatic differences. So I disagree with the idea that social sciences has some notches on its belt.
That's fine. What do you think, Roz, what's been said here?
Jen has her hand up.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Sorry, Jen.
Yeah. Actually, half of humanity does have a common job, even if we don't all have children. We have had throughout history and prehistory the job of giving birth and caring for children, whether by ourselves or with the help of others. We're mammals. Humans are mammals. We're all a mothering species, but we have divided our labor so that the male parts are doing other things than nurturing. And we have to bring back everyone to that maternal model, which is the model of the heart, which is the model that goes towards the other and nurtures the other, rather than trying to excel as one's individual self. And so that is a different way of knowledge, and looking at the world is through this other lens of gifting. And that continues throughout our society, but we don't notice it, we don't see it. And so we see ourselves as in the image of the male, but not really the male, which is not biological, it's a socialized patriarchal image. And so we need to return to this maternal caring way.
Now, Roz, my question to you was, from a political science point of view, the individual and society, how do you see those ontological entities? How does
Yeah, it's a really important question, right? Because usually the unit is the individual, right, who appears before the court or who is punished or wins their case. But there is a case where that's not the case, and that's international law. So I think it's very interesting what Sandy and Matt have said about reparations, because we have this situation where, like, the state, okay, we all belong to the state, and the state continues to exist across generations. So that everyone who was originally involved in debt is now dead doesn't matter, right? Like, states have to continue paying their debts, even if everyone who was involved was dead. Right, exactly, right? So it's the same with, like, slavery, or what we could say what we have come to regard as crimes, right? What we regard now as crimes, and we're saying these are crimes, and the state's responsible for the crimes it commits, just like states are responsible if they commit a war of aggression, or if they commit war crimes. The state is responsible for that. The state has to pay reparations for that. And this is the case, even though there may be people living in that state who are, against the war or against it, and who said, I've been telling you this whole time, this is the wrong way to go about things.
Yeah.
Right, it doesn't matter. You're still part of the state, and the state has that responsibility. So I think that's kind of a good way of sort of bridging this, if you want, this difference between, like, the individual and the state. Even if I'm a person who opposed, let's just say, the Iraq War, if I'm a member of a state that participated in that war, and I mean, in Ireland, a big thing in Ireland is that they have flown planes through Ireland, to take munitions to Iraq, right? And flew prisoners back to Ireland. So this is a big thing. I have a lot of friends who are really involved in like protesting that. But as a member of this state, I would still have to, part of my taxes potentially would have to go to paying reparations for this action that we did commit as a state, right? So I think that this is the way to bridge it in this kind of collective. As collectives, we belong to states. States are responsible. They're also potentially responsible across generations for wrongs they've committed. And I think Matt was right. It has like the potential to say, we are like maybe uplifting ourselves by saying, hey, like we did a wrong thing. You know, like, I mean, whatever that is, you know, could be the war in Iraq, could be something else, like, and that's my personal thing, but, you know, and we're not going to do that again, right? Like, in some ways, you're kind of saying we're going to like pay for what we did because we acknowledge it was wrong, and now we're going to move forward and not going to do those kind of things anymore. Like that's the hope anyway, I would say, with that.
Yeah, collective redemption rather than collective punishment.
What do you say, Asad, to that? Asad,
May I make a comment that Indigenous societies govern bottom up, reinforce gender equity, because 50% of the population were women.
I'm sorry. Yeah, can you just say it one more time, please? I don't see who is saying it actually, so I'm a little confused. Yeah.
It was Turnbull, I believe.
Ah, okay. I don't see.
But then he's gone away from the screen.
I see. Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't hear that. If somebody did, they can respond. I didn't hear it. Yeah.
Sorry, if Taylor can unmute that, we'll be able to hear them.
I see. All right. I was wondering if Asad had any comment on the notion, you know, obviously you're saying that it's all individual, and you're being told by, I think a couple of us have felt that perhaps that's not the only, there is a level of the individual, but there's also the level of the collectivity. I mean, when Russia launches an operation in Ukraine or the United States in Iraq, it's not individuals doing things to individuals. All right, there is a collective entity doing it to a collective entity, and therefore the issue of justice involves, you know, making some restitution there. So no, it cannot be reduced to individual levels. Asad. Not everything can be. I'm sure there are other issues that are. So what do you say to that, Asad?
I was making
All
a
right,
different
this will be my final comment because I have to leave. This is late.
Sure.
But basically, what is the meaning of life? What is it all about? Basically, in the end, we all die alone. And so the issue is about, as I see it, personal development. How can I use this environment, society, geography, everything, to achieve the potential for excellence within myself? So basically, everything boils down to my own evolution in the spiritual journey which we have in our lives. And all else is just fanfare. Doesn't matter whether there is justice in the world or not, and whether climate catastrophe beckons or not. It ultimately boils down to this. This is one perspective. And there's the opposite perspective, that we are just specks in the dust in the wind. And these two have to be kept in mind at the same time in order to, basically it's like a Zen koan. And that's something which cannot be resolved by logic and by talking. It has to be integrated into the heart. That's why a conversation about that is meaningless.
I see. Okay. I know Jen had her hand raised on this issue.
Well, let's see if, yeah. I think that we can't develop as individuals unless we are other oriented towards the other individuals in our society. And so that unless we nurture in either an individual way or a social way or some way that will solve problems rather than creating them, we're not developing as individuals.
I was trying to make a remark about gender equity, that if Indigenous societies automatically provided gender equity because 50% of the population were females, and you had governance from the bottom up. And at the moment we got bottom power coming, pyramids of power from the top down. And that reinforces my argument that there's an intellectual black hole and how to design constitutions of organizations that give power to the people and enrich democracy from the bottom up, and all social institutions, be they in the public, private, or non-profit sectors. And that's the vacuum that we need to fill for those who survive the disaster that's facing humanity in the next few hundred years. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Well, let me raise the last question here for all of you, something that I've been thinking about. Are we in process to World War III? I mean, it's not something economists normally talk about as a routine topic. You know, it doesn't appear in a macroeconomics textbook, but all the signs are that we're halfway there. And surely, like climate change, it's a looming extinction crisis facing us. What do you think about that? Roz, what do you think?
You mean country versus country, like nuclear war?
No, this is World War III. I mean, look, you know the East-West thing that's been going on. You know it's a proxy war against Russia, or the other way around, whichever way you want to see it. And this can only lead, if it continues, to a global conflagration. And once it turns nuclear, it is an extinction event like climate change. So what, you know, why is that not part of our conversation about everything, really? I mean, it's as important, I think, as anything else.
I was at a conference once and we were talking about nuclear weapons, and some guy said that sounds really 1980s. And I was like, well, we still have all the weapons, you know? So it's like, it didn't go away just because the 1980s stopped. But like, yeah, I don't know. I like personally, I think more likely, like if it happens, I guess it'll happen, right? But I think it's more likely to kind of be more a multipolar world. I think like the West is kind of cutting itself off and probably turning inwards focused, because I think they like to have an enemy. I think like, you know, Russia and China are like a convenient enemy and a way to define yourself against those external enemies. And I think a lot of American hawks are kind of falling back on that position that's worked for them before as a way to define themselves in opposition of these other states out there. That knowledge of those states is basically cut off from their people, and they're just kind of like this, you know, threatening enemy. So that's what it seems more like to me, that it's more of a question of they didn't succeed quite in taking over the whole world. Like they really thought they were for a long time. And if it's not going to work, then they're going to draw a line, and that's us and that's them, kind of.
Matt, what do you think?
Well, I guess as they say, you know, there may be a World War III, but there will never be a World War IV. I mean, I think it, other than the name, we really have in the opening first question, I think, you know, it did come up. I mean, the militarization, the violence in every level. So, yeah, I mean, it's certainly part of the crisis.
So it is a clear and present danger, which is the term that they use for many things. What do you think, Sandy? Is this, how does this affect the conversation we've been having?
I'm really not sure. I mean, if we do have a situation where the entire globe is engaged in a war simultaneously, I have no idea what the consequences or implications will be for these other types of issues. I assume that being occupied by war will prevent us from dealing with these other problems, and may actually be fodder for a greater enthusiasm for authoritarian rulers. So yeah, let's hope this doesn't happen.
Yeah. Has anybody not spoken? Jen, what do you think? World War III?
Well, I think it's possible. The climate crisis is impending almost as soon as a World War III would be. We can also have other pandemics and world poverty is increasing so much. So for me, I have to play it as if what I do as best I can, and I can't solve the possibility of nuclear war, although I could go to demonstrations about it, but that's not going to solve it either. And even the climate crisis is demonstrations about the climate crisis are probably not going to do very much. So there is a question of consciousness raising of everyone. And eventually that might help, but I believe we're in sort of a flux of many different streams, and hopefully the better streams will win out.
Certainly, it seems to me that the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe and climate change, pose limits to the kind of rational conversation that we've been having about conventional issues. Suddenly, it raises the issue of complete, not just human extinction, but planetary extinction, other forms of life as well. So I think that is not something that we are schooled to or educated to even think about, whether it's the unthinkable, and yet the unthinkable is right around the corner. It could happen any day, given the tensions that are being stoked up deliberately or not by all sides. So in many ways, I think the academy remains the last to catch up with certain kinds of reality, only because we think perhaps in a more focused way on things we can manage, things we can control, things we can, and not things we can't. But as a human being, I think we have to take all these into account. I mean, this is as I said, it's a climacteric. It's like the end of an epoch, start of another, and there may not be another. So I don't know. I'm moved by that all the time. And so sometimes I think, are we expending time unnecessarily on minor issues? So don't talk about inflation and unemployment maybe, but not inflation, not balance of trade, not who gets what, but rather how are we going to survive as a species on this planet, given that whatever's going on is the net outcome of processes, politics, ways of being, whether you call it capitalism or call it modernism. These have produced those effects. So until we rethink, and that's why I did this whole panel, is we need to rethink, I believe, from scratch, everything. And maybe this is an opportunity. The threat of extinction is an opportunity to do so. That things have not gone well, whether you're a socialist or a cap, doesn't matter. Neither side has, left or right, has not really produced solutions, historically at least, particularly in the West, that are particularly inspiring. I mean, they've all failed in their own right. So maybe it is time to reconsider everything. Anyway, that's my comment. If there's anybody else who wants to say something, please go ahead. Otherwise, we're probably pretty close to closing. Yeah.
Mothers did not create this crisis.
All right, I'll exempt you, Genevieve. You did not create it. I give you a blanket exemption. You're free. But not Margaret Thatcher, sorry, and not Catherine the Great, and not Marie Antoinette. She was a mother too. So let's not idealize unnecessarily. Anyway, thank you all for being here. And I know it was very difficult for many of you to be here. I appreciate all of you, and I hope we can do this again, because if nothing else, we could be the little oases of sanity in a world that is indecipherable and more insane every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a safe
Thank you,
night.
Rajani, and thanks to you all.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you. But let's all thank Diane, who has seen
Yes.
us through
Thanks,
technically.
Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
Diane, would you show yourself once at least to all of us? There she is.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much, Diane.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you, Diane. We couldn't have done this without you.
And thanks, Rajani.
Okay, take care, Matt. Take care, Jen. Take care, Ross.